I thought my rescue cat was just a greedy scavenger who couldn't shake his street instincts. I spent weeks watching my dinner disappear, piece by piece, only to find the thief wasn't eating the food at all. He was running a secret nursery under my floorboards for a creature that should have been his natural enemy. I was an old man waiting for the end, but my cat decided we were both going to be fathers instead. The wind at Timberline Peak didn't just blow, it searched. It whistled through the gaps in the cedar logs of Elias Thorne's cabin, looking for a way to extinguish the small fire crackling in the hearth. Elias, a man whose face was etched with the deep, rugged lines of 70 winters, sat in his usual chair. His hair was the color of a frozen lake, and his hands, once capable of carving intricate furniture, now mostly held a cold ceramic mug, the last thing his wife, Martha, had touched before the silence took her. 12 years had passed since the cabin had been a home. Now, it was just a structure. After Martha passed during a particularly brutal frost, the kind that turned the breath to ice before it left the lips, Elias had let the world outside the treeline fade away. He didn't fix the sagging porch step. He didn't scrape the peeling green paint from the window frames. He existed on leftover time, eating cold tins of beans and watching the snow bury the road until the mailman stopped trying to make the climb. He had become a ghost in a house of memories, convinced that he had nothing left to give and even less to lose. He was waiting for the mountain to reclaim him, just as it had reclaimed his joy. The visitor in the storm. The change began on a Tuesday in late November. The temperature had plummeted, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of gray and white. Elias was staring at a bowl of lukewarm broth when he heard it, a sound so faint he thought it was the house settling under the weight of the snow. Tap! Tap! It wasn't the heavy thud of a branch or the erratic scattering of hail. It was deliberate. Elias stood, his knees popping like dry kindling, and moved to the heavy oak door. When he pulled it open, the golden light of the kitchen spilled out onto the porch, illuminating a tiny, shivering shape. It was a ginger tabby, his fur matted with ice and his ribs standing out like the hull of a wrecked ship. This was Jasper. Jasper hadn't always been a mountain cat. He was a survivor of the valley floor, a creature who had learned that being loud got you kicked, but being invisible got you the occasional scrap of pizza crust or a licked-clean tuna tin. He was a master of the margins, a cat who took only what the world threw away. Elias looked at the cat, and for a moment, the memory of Martha's soft hands tending to the garden birds flashed through his mind. He couldn't leave a living thing to turn into a statue of ice on his doorstep. He knelt, painfully, slowly, and scooped the bundle of frozen fur into his coat. The mystery of the vanishing meals. Jasper recovered with a quiet intensity. Within a week, his coat had fluffed into a vibrant sunset orange, and his amber eyes had regained a sharp, intelligent glow. But he was a strange companion. He never begged. He never meowed for his bowl to be filled. Instead, he watched. Elias began to notice things were missing. It started with a corner of a sourdough loaf. Elias had turned to reach for the butter, and when he looked back, a jagged, clean semicircle had been removed from the bread. There were no crumbs, no mess, just a void where sustenance used to be. A few days later, Elias fried 2 small sausages. He placed them on a plate to cool. He walked to the window to check the thermometer, and by the time he returned, 1 sausage was gone. Jasper was sitting perfectly still by the stove, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws, looking at Elias with a mask of perfect innocence. "I'm losing my mind," Elias muttered, rubbing his temples. He blamed his age. He blamed the isolation. He assumed he was eating his own meals and forgetting the act entirely. But the thefts grew bolder. An entire tin of sardines disappeared from the counter. A bowl of stew, still steaming, lost a perfect portion of meat as if scooped out by a tiny phantom ladle. Jasper grew sleeker, but he also grew busier. At night, Elias could hear the soft scritch-scritch of Jasper dragging something heavy across the floorboards. The secret under the floor. The truth came to light during the first true blizzard of December. A loose floorboard near the pantry, one Elias had meant to nail down for a decade, was slightly ajar. As Elias walked past with his morning coffee, he saw a flash of orange fur disappear into the dark gap. Setting his coffee down, Elias fetched an old crowbar and a flashlight. He pried up the board, expecting to find a nest of mice or a hoard of stolen kibble. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dust, and Elias's breath hitched in his throat. There, tucked into a nest made of stolen dish towels and a discarded wool scarf, was Jasper. And he wasn't alone. Curled against the cat's warm side was a creature of the wild, a bobcat kitten, no more than 10 weeks old. The cub was a mosaic of spots and tufts, his ears tipped with black fur, but his body was tragically thin. Jasper didn't hiss. He didn't run. He simply stood up and pushed a dried piece of stolen chicken toward the cub with his nose. He was sharing his spoils. The bobcat, whom Elias would later name Silas, looked up with wide, frightened eyes. He was a refugee from the storm, likely separated from his mother during the sudden freeze. In the brutal hierarchy of the mountain, he should have been a predator, and Jasper should have been prey. But here, in the shadows of the floorboards, they were something else. They were a team. Elias stared at the two of them, the street-smart scavenger and the starving prince of the woods. He looked at the hoard Jasper had built, neatly stacked cracker wrappers, half-eaten jerky and dried crusts. It was an archive of survival. Jasper wasn't stealing for greed. He was stealing because he knew what it was like to have nothing, and he refused to let the smaller, wilder version of himself face the darkness alone. Elias felt a sudden, sharp crack in the icy shell that had surrounded his heart for 12 years. He realized that while he had been waiting for his life to end, Jasper had been busy starting a new one. "Well," Elias whispered, his voice thick with a rustiness he hadn't felt in years, "if we're going to be thieves, we might as well be well-fed ones." Elias didn't nail the floorboard back down. Instead, he went to the freezer, pulled out a package of venison he had ignored for months, and began to cook a meal that was meant for more than one. The kitchen of a timberline peak cabin, once a mausoleum of silence and dust-covered memories, was now a theater of silent, feline shadows. Elias Thorne found himself moving with a lightness that had long been absent from his frame. He was no longer just a man waiting for the winter to claim him. He was a silent accomplice to a pair of outlaws. As Silas, the bobcat cub, regained his strength, his wild nature began to merge with the survivalist cunning Jasper had spent a lifetime perfecting. Elias watched from the periphery, pretending to read his old books while actually observing the most peculiar mentorship he had ever witnessed. Jasper, the cream and orange domestic survivor, was teaching Silas the code of the leftovers. The salvage code. The rules were strict and unspoken. They never took food directly from Elias's hands. If he offered a piece of meat, they would pull back, their eyes wide and suspicious, until he placed it on the floor and turned his back. Jasper had taught Silas that abundance was a trap, but a discarded scrap was a victory. They lived in the margins of Elias's life, treating every meal as if it were a salvaged prize from a world that didn't want them. Silas, however, was a clumsy student. While Jasper moved like a ghost, sliding across the linoleum with the silence of falling snow, Silas was a riot of oversized paws and youthful enthusiasm. One afternoon, Elias left a large, boiled potato on the counter to cool. He heard a rhythmic thump-slide thump and looked over his shoulder. Silas had managed to hook the potato with a single claw and was now trying to drag it across the kitchen floor. It rolled like a boulder, leaving a trail of starch and confusion, while Jasper watched from the top of the refrigerator with an expression of profound disappointment. Then there was the corn cob incident. Silas had decided that a discarded corn cob was the ultimate prize. He wedged it horizontally in his mouth, his head tilted back as he waddled awkwardly toward the hidden gap under the floorboards. The cob was too wide for the opening. He gagged, his throat making a series of alarming sounds as he refused to let go of his treasure. Jasper eventually had to jump down, biting the other end of the cob and helping Silas maneuver it through the gap like two construction workers, carrying a steel beam into a narrow alley. Elias laughed. It was a hoarse, rusty sound at first, scratching up from a chest that hadn't felt joy in a decade, but it soon became a frequent inhabitant of the cabin. The house of scraps, the hoard, under the floorboards grew exponentially. Elias, now fully invested in the game, began to accidentally leave things where they could be found. He would fry extra bacon and leave it on the edge of the table. He would forget to put the lid on the tuna tin. One day, while cleaning the space near the floorboards, Elias found that the cats were returning the favor. In a small, clean corner of the pantry, he found a pile of the best parts. A fresh piece of meat Silas had caught in the yard, a perfect, unblemished cracker Jasper had swiped from a box. They were eating the crumbs and the freezer-burned edges themselves, pushing the freshest portions toward the man who kept the fire burning. "You're looking out for me, aren't you?" Elias whispered, touching a soft tuft of Jasper's fur. He realized then that he wasn't just feeding animals. He was part of a pack. He began to fix the cabin, not because he cared about the house, but because his family needed a fortress. He nailed the loose porch step. He insulated the windows. He even left a small, permanent gap in the back door, a passage between the wild and the warm. The fury of the frost. The peace was shattered in mid-January. A diamond dust storm hit the peak, a phenomenon where the air becomes so cold that water vapor freezes into tiny crystals that glitter in the sun. But there was no sun this time. Only a howling, charcoal sky and hail that pounded the roof like 1,000 hammer blows. Silas had slipped out into the forest earlier that afternoon, his growing wild instincts calling him to track the mountain hares in the brush. As the hail turned into a blinding wall of ice, Silas didn't return. Jasper was frantic. The small cat didn't hide under the stove or curl into his nest. He paced the back door, scratching at the wood and letting out a long, mournful cry that Elias had never heard before. Jasper looked at Elias, his amber eyes wide with a desperate plea. "My friend is out there. The small one is in the cold." The weight of the past hit Elias like a physical blow. 12 years ago, the storm had won. He had stood inside, clutching a warm blanket, while the life of his Martha slipped away because the mountain wouldn't let him through. He had spent a decade paralyzed by that failure. But as he looked at Jasper, Elias felt a fire ignite in his bones that the mountain couldn't extinguish. "Not again," Elias growled. "Not on my watch." The rescue. Elias donned his heavy, moth-eaten wool coat and grabbed a heavy wooden board to hold over his head against the bruising hail. He stepped out into the chaos. The wind tried to knock him back, the ice stinging his face and turning his breath into a ragged mist. He pushed into the tree line, his flashlight beam dancing across frozen pines and jagged rocks. His legs, stiff with age and arthritis, burned with the effort, but he didn't stop. He called Silas's name, his voice lost in the roar of the wind. After an hour of searching, he saw it, a flash of spotted fur wedged deep into the hollow of an ancient, fallen cedar. Silas was curled in a tight ball, his body stiffening, his eyes glazed with the onset of hypothermia. Ice had begun to form on his whiskers. Elias didn't hesitate. He dropped the board, knelt in the frozen dirt, and scooped the bobcat into his arms. Silas was too weak to growl, too cold to fear. He simply collapsed against Elias's chest, seeking the last spark of warmth in the world. The trek back to the cabin was a blur of pain and determination. Elias stumbled over roots, his lungs screaming, but he held the cub as if he were carrying his own heart. When he finally burst through the door, he collapsed onto the kitchen floor, gasping for air, with the shivering cub still tucked inside his coat. The thaw. Jasper was on them instantly. He didn't wait for Silas to be placed by the fire. He began to lick the ice from the bobcat's ears, his loud, rhythmic purring acting as a heartbeat for the both of them. Elias spent the night on the floor. He wrapped Silas in Martha's old wool blanket, the one he hadn't touched in a decade. He heated broth and fed it to the cub drop by drop, just as Jasper had once done with the stolen scraps. As the sun began to rise over a world buried in fresh white, Silas finally opened his eyes and let out a small, raspy trill. Jasper curled around him, and for the first time in 12 years, Elias fell asleep without the weight of 1,000 what-ifs crushing his chest. He had faced the storm, and this time he had brought the life back home. The leftover life. In the weeks following the rescue, Elias realized a profound truth. They were all living on life's leftovers. He had been hoarding his grief like Jasper hoarded bread crusts, keeping it in the dark corners of his heart, waiting for a catastrophe that had already passed. But looking at the two cats, one wild, one tame, both survivors, he saw that the margins of life were where the real strength was found. They were not unwanted scraps. They were the essential pieces that made the whole again. The cabin was no longer a place where things went to die. It was a place where things were repaired. Elias fixed the roof. He painted the walls. He started cooking real meals again, Not because he was hungry, but because his family deserved the best he had to give. However, as spring began to whisper through the melting snow, Elias noticed Silas staring longer and longer at the greening forest. The bobcat was no longer a clumsy kitten. He was becoming a magnificent creature of the mountain, and the wild was calling its son home as the frost of that harrowing winter finally surrendered to the insistent warmth of spring. A change settled over the cabin on Timberline Peak. Silas, the bobcat who had once been a shivering bundle of spots and hunger, was no longer the clumsy acrobat who rolled potatoes across the floor. His muscles had filled out into a display of wild, coiled power. The tufts on his ears stood tall, and his golden-green eyes began to reflect the deep, emerald shadows of the forest rather than the yellow glow of the kitchen. Elias watched him from the porch, noticing how Silas would stand at the edge of the treeline for hours, his tail twitching with a rhythm that belonged to the ancient pines. The coat of the leftovers was being replaced by the call of the hunt. It happened gradually. Silas would disappear for a day, then two, returning with the scent of damp earth and cedar on his fur. Elias understood. Some creatures were meant to be mended, not owned, and true love often meant having the strength to open the door. One morning, the gap in the back door remained still. Silas had slipped out into the spring mist and did not return. Elias called into the trees for 3 days, his voice echoing against the ridges, but the forest offered no answer. Silas was gone, reclaimed by the wilderness where he belonged. The silence of Jasper. The impact of Silas's departure on Jasper was profound. The small ginger cat, who had once been a tireless architect of stolen hoards, suddenly lost his spark. The thieving stopped almost overnight. Elias would leave half a sandwich on the counter, and it would remain untouched until it grew stale. Jasper no longer dragged heavy treasures across the floorboards or meticulously organized tuna lids in his secret museum. Elias realized, with a heavy heart, that Jasper's hoarding had never been about his own hunger. The old instinct born from the scarcity of the railroad tracks had transformed into an act of devotion. He had been providing for his wild brother. Without Silas to feed, the theft had no purpose. Jasper spent his days sitting by the door, staring into the green shadows, waiting for a spotted shape that never emerged. There were 2 survivors again, mourning a third who had returned to the light. The weight of years. Years marched across the mountain like a slow-moving glacier. Elias grew older, his hair turning from the color of fresh snow to a translucent white. His hands, once steady enough to find a bobcat in a blizzard, now trembled when he poured his tea. His breath came shorter, and the steps of the cabin felt steeper with every passing season. Jasper grew old alongside him. His vibrant orange fur faded to a pale, dusty shade, and his amber eyes became clouded with the milky haze of age. His leaps were no longer spry. He moved with a deliberate, slow grace, always staying within a few feet of Elias. They were a pair of old ghosts haunting a sanctuary they had built together from the scraps of their lives. Despite the physical decline, the cabin was no longer a tomb of grief. Elias had made peace with the memory of his daughter, Emily. He realized that saving Jasper and Silas hadn't been an attempt to replace her, but a way to honor her by choosing to protect life instead of drowning in sorrow. The house was full of the quiet sounds of survival, the clatter of a bowl, the soft purr of a cat, and the crackle of a fire that never went out. The night the world tilted. The crisis came on a night when the temperature dropped so low the trees themselves seemed to groan in the cold. Elias was standing in the kitchen, reaching for a mug, when a sudden, violent dizziness seized him. The room tilted, the familiar walls spinning into a blur of green and brown. He collapsed into his armchair, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird against his ribs. He couldn't reach the phone. He couldn't even call out. The same icy numbness he remembered from the night Emily died began to seep into his bones. He felt himself slipping, the light of the cabin fading into a deep blue twilight. Jasper was the first to notice. The old cat, usually so quiet, began to meow with a desperate, piercing urgency. He ran in circles around the chair, knocking a bowl off the counter to create a crash that might wake the world. When Elias didn't move, Jasper jumped onto the table and dragged the heavy linen tablecloth down, pulling it over Elias's legs in a frantic attempt to provide warmth. He meowed until his voice was a ragged whisper, a sound that echoed through the empty woods. The return of a sentinel. In the deepest part of the night, when the wind was at its most vicious, the gap in the back door creaked. Silas had returned. He was no longer a cub, but a massive, magnificent predator of the ridge, his muscles rippling under a thick winter coat. He squeezed through the small opening he had not used in years, his claws clicking softly on the wood. He did not growl. He did not seek food. With a surprising gentleness, the wild bobcat used his teeth to pull a heavy wool blanket from the sofa, draping it across Elias's chest. Then, Silas did something extraordinary. He lay down across the gap in the door, his large, muscular body acting as a living seal against the freezing wind that whistled through the cracks. Jasper pressed himself against Elias's side, his purr vibrating against the old man's ribs as if the frequency itself could keep a heart beating. The three of them, the domestic cat, the wild beast, and the dying man, formed a knot of survival in the darkness. They were breathing together, waiting for the dawn. The legacy of the leftovers. The mailman discovered them the next morning. He had come to deliver a package and noticed the door ajar. He found Elias unconscious but warm, flanked by a pale orange cat and a massive bobcat that stood over the chair like a guardian. The bobcat gave a low, warning growl before vanishing back into the forest as the sirens approached. Elias survived. In the hospital, a nurse asked him how he had made it through such a night at his age. "They stole away my lonely death," Elias replied with a faint smile. "I was ready to go, but they decided I still had more to give." When he returned to the cabin, a new ritual was established. Every late winter, Elias would find a gift on the porch, not a fresh kill, but the remains of a hunt, half a rabbit or a few fish, left by a creature who remembered the man who ran into the hail. Silas was telling him, "I remember. I care." Jasper began to hoard again, but only small things, crumbs hidden in the corner of the cabinet. Elias would find them and leave them there, a tribute to the journey they had all taken. He would even make hot milk and leave half the cup on the table, a leftover for whoever might be watching from the treeline. On the melting snow each spring, Elias would find 3 sets of footprints overlapping, a small cat, a massive bobcat, and an old man. He would trace them with his finger, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. They were the world's leftovers, the discarded, the forgotten, and the broken. But in the margins of the mountain, they had found that forgotten did not mean worthless, and leftover did not mean unwanted. They had found home. They had found family. And in the quiet sanctuary of Pine Ridge, they proved that no one has to survive the winter alone.